All right, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eddie Campbell, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of New Brunswick. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to the seventh talk in our the University of New Brunswick series, Ideas That Matter. This series features researchers from our Faculty of Arts here in Fredericton, some of Canada's leading scholars on topics that we believe to be of importance to New Brunswickers. This is part of what we believe here at our university to be our commitment to create an open forum for the exchange and debate of knowledge. I'm very, very pleased that we are partnering with elements of the private sector to bring this series to you, and I would like to thank the 13 organizations that have generously come on board as series patrons for 2012 and 2013. They're all listed in your program and on the sign at the back of the room, and it's a particular pleasure to announce the presence of Lee Winchester of the Bank of Montreal. Lee, stand up, being acknowledged by the crowd for your help in bringing this off. Now, so far as I know, none of our other representatives, our other private sector partners have been able to send representatives. If that's wrong, and you're here, please identify yourself so we can acknowledge you. Okay, perhaps not. I'd also like to thank our presenting sponsor, our Associated Alumni, for their very generous support and their interest in being part of this dialogue. The series is intended to shine a spotlight on the social sciences and humanities, highlighting their impact on New Brunswick and the world. And so far, we're doing great. It's very gratifying to me to look out and see this full house here this evening. Following the presentation by tonight's speaker, we will have a question and answer session, which I will moderate, and you will have an opportunity to join in the discussion. We're planning to let that run about 15 minutes or so. I do imagine that if there's interest, Greg will be more than willing to stay behind and talk to folks. And in that connection, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Greg Keeley. You may know that Greg Keeley is a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts at our university, specializing in Canadian social and labor history and security and intelligence history. He has authored or co-authored 4 books, including this light reading tome here. Pass her up. Secret Service, you can read it before bedtime tonight. It's only 687 pages long. So it's called Secret Service, Political Policing in Canada from the Fenians to Fortress America. I would like to acknowledge that Greg has very extensive academic accomplishments, numerous grants, prizes, and appointments. He is a fellow, for example, of both the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Canada. And as our past Vice President Research and Provost, he has chaired the boards of the university's 4 research institutes. He has served on numerous committees and boards, including that of the Social Sciences Federation of Canada, and he is also, interestingly, a member of the Council of Canadian Academies expert panel on the state of science and technology in Canada. I think that's a mark of the accomplishments he has enjoyed in the portfolio of Vice President Research, that a historian would be found suitable to serve on a committee to advise on science and technology in our country. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Modern History from the University of Toronto and Master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Rochester. His talk this evening is entitled, The RCMP, CSIS, and Spying, Canadians Under Surveillance. Before I close that rather dry set of remarks with respect to Greg's credentials, I would like to acknowledge what a great pleasure it has been for me coming here to the University of New Brunswick in 2009 to work with Greg in his role as Vice President Research and Provost. It's an inspiration to us administrators who aspire to continue, at least in some form, our research careers, to have such an accomplished scholar among the administrative group at UNB. And I'm very happy at the accomplishments we have enjoyed over the past 3 years. Greg's record over the past decade as Vice President of Research is simply incredible, as perhaps the least mark of his accomplishments in that role. The university has just about tripled its annual external funding again, that's a very shallow measure of the way the university has transformed its research activities under his leadership, but it is very impressive nonetheless. And I'm also happy to acknowledge that Greg and Linda were extremely kind to my wife Diane and I when we arrived, and I'm very happy to call him my friend, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing from Greg this evening. Greg, if you would.
Well, thank you very much, Eddie, and of course, I'm delighted that we've become friends over the years we've worked together. I also thank you all for coming out tonight. I know there were many other options tonight, and I'm delighted that so many of you have chosen this one. I know there would have been more media, except that the Premier wasn't very cooperative, and he made a lot of news today that knocked other news out. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually read a text to you. I don't normally do that, but I thought it is one way of actually disciplining myself to try and stay within the appropriate time frame. And what I'm going to do is read from the conclusions of Secret Service, editing fairly significantly. So if you want to read the unedited version, it's the last chapter, not surprisingly. And before I start, I should of course say that this is a co-authored book. There's 3 authors, of which I'm one. But it's also Reg Whittaker, a prominent political scientist and expert on security and intelligence matters, extremely well published, retired from York, but now attached to the University of Victoria. And Andy Parnaby, who's another historian and a former student of mine who teaches at Cape Breton University in Sydney. So, to the text. Political policing has been a persistent feature of Canadian political life from the origins of national government in the mid-19th century through to the present. At all times and under all circumstances, governments have felt the need to police the frontiers of political activity and political expression, drawing enforceable lines separating the legitimate from the illegitimate, maintaining and reinforcing deference to authority. Policing in democracies like Canada, while officially about criminal law enforcement, is also about the surveillance and control of particular groups and communities in the name of public safety and national security. In this latter guise, policing is not only political, but always to some degree carried out in secret. While there are invariably technical and practical justifications advanced for maintaining secrecy in political policing, there is another less neutral reason. Coercive intervention by the liberal democratic state into the political life of its citizens should always be a matter for concern. The fundamental liberal democratic values of freedom, equality, and the rule of law are all challenged by political policing. A dominant strain of thinking among office holders over the years has been better to let the sleeping dogs of political opposition lie rather than wake them to an uncertain reaction. In a totalitarian or authoritarian state, the secret police are unashamedly the props of the ruling party or dictator. But in a democracy, policing is supposed to be in defense of public liberties, even as political policing enforces a dominant ideology and protects the dominant classes and communities. The secrecy surrounding political policing serves not only to facilitate its operations, but to mask its multiple roles and tactics, some far less presentable on their face than others. Political policing has been justified as the necessary means to protect the democratically elected regime from the enemies of democracy, who aim to impose minority rule through force, and as such has usually found widespread public support. But beyond protecting the country from espionage, sabotage, terrorism, political violence, and covert foreign interference, state security has also targeted groups and individuals said to be seditious or subversive, terms whose vagueness and lack of definition have been inversely matched by corresponding fervor and passion on the part of those hunting subversives, whoever or whatever they might be. Those targeted as subversives assert that it is they who are seeking to achieve the democratic ideals of equality and freedom against a state and society that unfairly denies them full access to these goods, and then subjects them to political policing when they protect injustice. Political policing has, over the years, targeted a long list of those labeled extremist threats that includes, among others, workers striking for higher wages and better working conditions, refugees fleeing political conflict, and persecution abroad, gay men and lesbian women, religious sects like the Doukhobors and Jehovah's Witnesses, democratic socialists, Quebec nationalists and separatists, First Nation activists, anti-globalization protesters, environmentalists, and so on. The secrecy surrounding political policing not only serves to cover potential embarrassment over political biases, but also masks methods and techniques that are not in keeping with liberal democratic norms, and even to a degree mimic the methods of authoritarian regimes. Political surveillance involves the routine gathering of a vast amount of information, much of which is apparently harmless, but may acquire more sinister connotations when matched and juxtaposed in police dossiers to other seemingly innocuous information, or when shared with other agencies possessing little restraint and less oversight. Beginning with the infiltration of political gatherings, political policing inevitably expands into the penetration of the private world of individuals targeted, listening in on their conversations, reading their mail, tracking their purchases, monitoring their personal relationships. The enlistment of human sources to spy on co-workers, associates, and friends carries the penetration of intimacy even deeper. At times, the state has sought actively but covertly to counter and disrupt the activities of associations of civil society labeled subversive or politically dangerous. One striking observation in light of Canadian evolution from colony of the British Empire to self-governing nation to junior partner in the American Empire is that political policing in Canada has always been framed within a wider imperial architecture of global policing. The surveillance of Fenian threats to Canada in the mid-19th century was carried out largely on American soil in conjunction with British imperial forces. Pre-World War I surveillance of South Asian activists similarly was carried on by Canadians working under the direction of the India and colonial offices in London with links to the police in India. Amid the gathering clouds of great power rivalries that were to erupt in the First World War, British intelligence detected German efforts to mobilize Irish and Indian extremists to instigate colonial revolts against the empire. Political policing in Canada was part of broader imperial strategy, and Ottawa, dutifully, was preoccupied with subversive groups and individuals whose real enemy was the mother country rather than Canada. The imperial framework was further reflected in the means adopted by Canada to play its part. Canada's embryonic secret service, both in the 1860s and early 1900s, relied heavily on Britain's extensive diplomatic presence in the United States to target its enemies. Regular communication channels between the Canadian and British governments on matters of security and intelligence were established, material first flowing via the Governor-General, and as time went on by a more direct route between the Mounties and the appropriate British agency. The creation of the RCMP in February of 1920, with its exclusive responsibility for surveillance and intelligence gathering operations, produced the first made-in-Canada national political police force. But the RCMP were far from autonomous. While the importance of the old country declined after the First World War, it did not disappear. Throughout the Great Depression, the ideological mission of the RCMP was the defense of British values and British traditions against communist subversion. The significance of British values as a touchstone for political debate in Canada did not diminish until well after the Second World War. The RCMP were also moving into another external relationship that would prove more long-lasting. By the mid to late 1920s, regular intelligence exchanges between Canada and the United States were developing, including lists of deported radicals and suspected communists, fingerprint records, and photographs. The relationship between the RCMP and FBI was formalized in 1937. The Second World War greatly accelerated cooperation, and the succeeding era of the Cold War firmly established the close integration of Canadian security intelligence operations within the Western Alliance under American leadership. On crucial issues, among them the 1945 Six Gouzenko spy affair and the Herman Norman suicide during the Suez Crisis, the links between the RCMP and their American counterparts proved as strong as or stronger than the ties between the police and their Canadian political masters. A thick web of interrelations survived the end of the Cold War and the civilianization, of the security service, and continued into the post-9/11 era of the global war on terror. By this time, the American ties of both CSIS and the RCMP had become highly controversial, as the ugly impact of the dark side of the war on terror on individual Canadians like Mahar Arar became widely known. As the pictures flash by you, the next one is actually Mahar Arar with his wife in the background. And of course, earlier on in the slideshow, there's a picture of Herbert Norman shaking hands with Mike Pearson, who will be recognizable to many of you. The question of how the security service should best be organized goes back to the initial creation of the RCMP. The government at the time was searching for a way to undertake political policing on a wider and more sustained basis that would be affordable, politically viable, and effective. In the Union government of Prime Minister Borden, there were opposing views coming from the influential conservative C.H. Kahan and a liberal minister, Newton Rawle. Kahan liked the American model of the FBI, then emerging within the U.S. Department of Justice, particularly the advantages of combining criminal law enforcement with the political policing of revolutionary unrest and subversion, which he wished the new force to pursue with a vengeance. Rawle disliked a policy of excessive repression that could only alienate progressive but moderate elements in the community who, he said, insist on freedom of thought and freedom of speech on social and economic questions, unquote. Rawle's view prevailed, and Kahan, who lacked the entrepreneurial talent of J. Edgar Hoover, failed to create a Canadian FBI clone. The RCMP security service that did emerge, however, was just as focused on hunting Reds as Hoover's FBI, but it did so in a political culture that was less permissive of enterprising and self-aggrandizing bureaucrats like Hoover, politicizing security, building political alliances, and cultivating extravagant personal media images, not to speak of using secret files to intimidate and blackmail potential opponents, as has all become clear in recent years. The RCMP brass always preferred to keep anti-communism under the sober aegis of the Crown and out of the volatile political realm, even during the McCarthy era of the early 1950s. Although the RCMP had always benefited from its iconic public image, as celebrated in film, in print, and in self-promotional shows like the musical Ride, its brass proved sometimes surprisingly inept in practicing effective media spin when public relations difficulties beset the force. Certainly the Mounties proved less than effective in building political and public support when the security service became tainted with scandal in the 1970s by barn burning, burglars, and bombings. More of that later. The internal organization of the security service has evolved with time. In the early days, regional districts collected intelligence while a central staff collated and deployed the information obtained. Under wartime pressure in the 1940s, this structure became more streamlined, a process that continued throughout the post-war era with the need for massive security clearance programs in the public service and amongst immigration and citizenship applicants. All these activities, along with the requirements for Cold War counter-espionage operations, demanded more sophisticated organization, better information management over the burgeoning files, and more sophisticated, better educated intelligence officers. The latter requirement heated up the growing post-war calls for the civilianization of the security service, which appeared unsuccessfully in the 1969 Mackenzie Royal Commission and successfully in the 1981 MacDonald Commission. As with many intelligence agencies, the security service's capacity for collection tended to outrun its capacity for analysis and evaluation, a disparity that has persisted down to today. Even as CSIS analytical capacities have improved over the RCMP era, so too has the ever-expanding technological capacity for amassing largely unprocessed information. Given irresistibly growing demands on the security intelligence bureaucracy, and given the high importance attached by successive governments over the years to the tasks assigned the security service, it comes as something of a surprise to learn that the service was until recent decades habitually underfunded and understaffed, always struggling with perennial backlogs of security clearances and mountains of accumulated information waiting to be processed for its voluminous files. Of course, police, like the military, are always demanding more resources, but the sporadic effectiveness of RCMP lobbying for funding remains a bit of a puzzle. Perhaps the reluctance of the force to engage in political alliance building outside the bureaucracy left them vulnerable to the cost cutters. It was only after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 that CSIS's budget was significantly and consistently augmented. And actually, to bring that up to date, it's actually doubled from 2001 into the present, which can't be said of very many federal agencies. And the CSE, the Signals Intelligence Agency, has also doubled in the same period, and both have had, well, CSIS has had a massive headquarters building built in Ottawa, and CSE is having one at almost $1 billion built. The funding issue points to another continuity. extreme secrecy surrounding the funding of political policing. This began with McDonald's Secret Service funds, John A. McDonald's personal Secret Service funds spent at his personal discretion. The subsequent Liberal government of Alexander Mackenzie investigated McDonald's misuse of the Secret Service fund, but never questioned the fund's legitimacy, purpose, or secrecy. The oversight later established by Parliament fell far short of equivalent standards found in other democracies at the same time. With the establishment of the RCMP, funding of the security service was buried in the general appropriations for the force, and at no time in the succeeding decades did Parliament or the public get to see any breakdown of how Mountie money was spent on security intelligence. This information was considered privileged since any detail could assist Canada's enemies, allegedly. Only in the 1990s was the Office of the Auditor General authorized to begin examining value for money in Ottawa security intelligence expenditures, but much remains locked away from parliamentary and public scrutiny even today. And indeed, since we wrote the book, there has been even more backtracking by the current government. For instance, the Office of Inspector General, which was the internal mechanism to keep tabs on CSIS, was abolished in the omnibus budget bill of this spring. Turning to methods of operation, one lesson drawn from history is that the most important source of intelligence available to the security service has always been human sources, placed within the groups or organizations targeted. In the 19th and early to mid-20th centuries, human sources were not only invaluable, but indeed virtually the only sources. In the late 20th century, advances in surveillance technologies have permitted much wider use of technical sources, wiretaps, bugs, communication intercepts of various kinds, from low-tech mail openings to high-tech email and internet surveillance, satellite imagery, and so on. Yet human sources remain indispensable to political policing. High-tech surveillance techniques usually require dependence upon other agencies like the CSE, with elaborate protocols attached, and difficulties arise from the imposition of extensive judicial and other forms of regulation, and external review and control of the use of technical sources. Human sources come with the smallest burden of accountability. They are high-risk, yet high-gain propositions. For all their advantages, however, human sources have presented major problems for the spy masters handling them. Human sources have human flaws and human weaknesses. Human sources live double lives and systematically betray those with whom they associate closely. This may lead even their controllers to suspect their motives. When the colorful and very effective undercover agent Henri Le Caron, that's the sketch that is at the start of the show, was first hired, Sir John A. Macdonald warned his handler, and I quote, "A man who will engage to do what he offers to do, that is, betray those with whom he acts, is not to be trusted." Yet by the latter part of the 19th century, with Irish threats still at the forefront, the use of undercover agents had become routine and uncontroversial among Canada's political leaders. Intelligence gathering on South Asian groups in the early 20th century relied to a greater extent on informants, many paid, within that specific immigrant community. This was necessary, given the ethnicity of the police operatives, readily available on the Pacific coast at the time, who of course were primarily white. The difficulty of securing sources within ethno-cultural communities has been a persistent problem for political policing, persisting down to the notorious failure to gain access to the Sikh extremist groups behind the Air India bombing. Another recurrent problem with human sources is the extreme reluctance to use their evidence in criminal proceedings, for fear of revealing their identities and thus destroying their usefulness for ongoing intelligence gathering. In the wake of the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, a debate raged between the RCMP and the chief prosecutor in the cases brought against the strike leaders over the use of undercover agent Harry Blask, who actually was an RCMP agent named Zanath, and the RCMP officer in the slideshow is Zanath, Frank Zanath. And they debated using him as a star witness. In the end, law enforcement won the argument and the Mounties lost their top Labour spy. The most famous case of an undercover source publicly unveiled was in 1931, when undercover communist Jack Esselvine, wearing Mountie Red Serge as Sergeant John Leopold, stepped into the Toronto courtroom hearing the Communist 8 case, which was prosecution of the communist leadership. Despite this publicity coup, the depletion of effective and reliable sources within the communist and other left-wing groups was demonstrated within a few years by the debacle of the On to Ottawa trek, the Depression-era protest against unemployment and the relief camps. And the picture of the Communist Party banner is a a prior march to the Ottawa truck taking place in British Columbia. Human sources retained their critical value through the Cold War years when the Communist Party was effectively infiltrated and extensive networks of informants were built among trade unions, ethnic and immigrant communities, and other civil associations as part of a massive counter-subversion campaign. When the FLQ and other violent separatist groups made their appearance in the 1960s, the Security Service recruited informants in the initially unfamiliar milieu of Quebec nationalist ferment. So skilled did the service become that it enlisted as a paid RCMP source the second highest ranking member of the Parti Québécois government, Claude Morin. However important, even indispensable such sources might be, the problems associated with recruiting and running them persist. Recruitment of sources may draw on ideological belief or public spiritedness or monetary incentives, or more dubiously on intimidation or what amounts to virtually blackmail by the state. In this latter regard, security screening, especially of immigration and citizenship applicants, has been a tool for recruitment of human sources in groups to which the Security Service wishes to gain access. Ethical questions abound in such cases. Another issue, the more dangerous and threatening the groups targeted by human sources are, the more challenging becomes the handling and control of these sources. A source within a terrorist group, for instance, may have to engage in criminal or at the very least questionable acts to maintain their credibility, thus casting suspicions on the agency that controls them. Human sources planted in nonviolent groups raise different but equally troubling issues of Big Brother, Stasi-like surveillance of civil society. When such sources are revealed, as in the Morin affair, the result is embarrassment for the state, not to speak of potential political backlash. The election of a PQ government, of course, raises all those issues to the fore yet again. Many of the same issues with human sources also arise with regard to counterespionage and counterintelligence, with agents, double agents, disloyalty, and betrayal. Canada came late to this game, stumbling badly in the Second World War. The Gouzenko affair in 1945-6 placed Canada squarely at the center of the Cold War spy game, but the RCMP experienced continuing difficulties coping with the complexity of what some authors have described as the wilderness of mirrors. The mad mole hunt of the 1970s that consumed so many across the Western intelligence community struck in Canada as well, where an innocent outsider, Jim Bennett by name, was fingered as a KGB mole, while one of us, Gilles Brunet, got away with betraying his service and his country for KGB gold. He was the son of a quite prominent RCMP officer, was an RCMP officer himself, and never came under suspicion. Of course, successes in the murky world of counter-espionage may remain in the shadows, while most mistakes tend to break out on the front pages. But whatever the final score, by the close of the Cold War, counter-espionage was only one aspect and the least controversial of the Security Service's job description. Far more controversial, with far greater impact on Canadian society and Canadian democracy, was its political policing of subversion in all the protean forms that elusive concept could take in the minds of those charged with hunting it. One of the most consistent themes throughout the period covered by our book is the mission of the political police to identify, intrusively observe, and even actively counter subversive organizations formed among minority communities. The concept of suspect communities in a country like Canada is inherently controversial and certainly potentially divisive. The evolution of Canada from a British society in which state institutions unabashedly reflected white Anglo supremacy to the multi-ethnic and multicultural pluralism of today is an oft-told story. But the place within this story of the political policing of ethnic and cultural diversity is less familiar. Sometimes the targeting of particular communities as suspect has arisen simply from racial or religious prejudice. The treatment of Asian immigrants in the 19th century and later, from denial of the franchise to the internment of the entire Japanese-Canadian population in the Second World War, is illustrative of how difference could lead to the state construction of suspect communities. Ethnic bias was evident during the Great War when generalized suspicion was cast over entire enemy alien communities, that is, communities drawn from the nations with which Canada was at war, while with wholesale detentions following. The RCMP showed more selectivity in their interventions among immigrant communities in the 20s and 30s, in part because of a political dimension being added to the ethnic. The case of South Asian activists associated with emergent left-wing and radical movements in the early 20th century points the way to an important theme. When suspect ethnicity is allied to suspect politics, the political police redouble their attention. This became evident in the 1930s when the RCMP honed in on ethnic organizations associated with the Communist Party. Left-wing political and cultural centers such as the Finnish Organization of Canada and the Ukrainian Labor Farm Temple Association, as well as various Jewish organizations. The discriminatory element now turned on politics rather than religion. During the Second World War, left-wing Finns, Ukrainians, and Jews faced more of the sharp edge of the Defense of Canada regulations than their less radical brethren. In the post-war era, it was the same story, as the security service closely watched the pro-communist Ukrainians and Finns while treating more conservative ethnic organizations as Cold War allies. A final twist in ethnic policing is noteworthy in the contemporary era. Regional conflicts in various parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and South Asia, have been imported into Canada along with refugee and immigrants from these regions. Homeland lines of division have been reproduced in the diaspora communities. Antagonists abroad continue to be antagonists in Canada. Sikh Khalistan separatists versus India, Tamil versus Sinhalese Sri Lankans, Jewish supporters of Israel versus Palestinians. CSIS has been accused of bias in its interventions. For example, in the wake of the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, Tamils seeking refugee status in Canada have been suspected of association with the Tamil Tigers, a banned group, while accusations of CSIS being too close to the Sinhalese-dominated Sri Lankan government has also been voiced. Similarly, in the post-9/11 era, Palestinians and other Arabs and Muslims have been treated as suspect communities, which complain of unwanted CSIS attention, while Jewish groups have appeared as supporters of CSIS, lobbying successfully to ban Islamic groups like Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorists. The point here is not to disentangle and adjudicate these arguments, but simply to note that policing ethnic politics in an era of explosive and bitter regional ethnic conflicts is bound to cast the political policeman in an uncomfortable light. What is seen favorably by one group is seen as ethnic bias by another. Issues of ethnic, cultural, and religious bias aside, the overriding bias exhibited by the political policing over the entire period of study has been an ideological bias against the left. This is not surprising in light of the police mission to maintain order, which is most often interpreted as maintaining existing social structures and institutions. What is more surprising is that, when threats to the existing order have come from the opposite direction of the political spectrum, they have seemingly had little long-term effect on the conservative profile of the security service. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan made inroads into rural Canada, presenting a threat to order and to liberal democratic values. Yet the RCMP, obsessed with revolutionary agitators on the left, collected no intelligence on the Klan and had no interest in it. In the 1930s, extreme right-wing and pro-Nazi movements competed with communist and other left-wing groups in political protest. But the police concentration on the threat from the left was virtually exclusive. Indeed, the RCMP had to be nudged by senior bureaucrats to start tracking Italian pro-fascists in the late 1930s. And even while they rounded up fascist sympathizers in the war, the RCMP was publicly asserting that communists were the most dangerous enemies, notwithstanding the military struggle then being waged against fascism, the Soviet Union, of course, being an ally by then. On the RCMP's advice, communists remained interned while the USSR was a wartime ally. At war's end, the RCMP returned enthusiastically to the task of focusing exclusively on the communist threat under the new post-Gouzenko Cold War rules. Under these rules, communism was the fifth column for the Soviet Union, which posed an all-fronts threat to the Western world. What is particularly striking about the security service's focus on anti-communism is that it was always less about the Soviet military threat or Soviet espionage and more about communism as subversion. Perhaps the metaphor invoked by C.H. Gahan, the conservative advocate of the FBI-like structure, in 1918, just after the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik menace as a many-headed poisonous hydra symbolizing anarchic disorder brought on by the wretched of the earth, was an enduring text for the narrative of political policing. From the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, there was one source of potential communist support that demanded policing: labor militancy. The specter of the Winnipeg General Strike, where labor unrest appeared to escalate into a potential threat to the capitalist system, haunted the defenders of order for decades. Indeed, it was the combined wallop of the National Labor Revolt and the Great War that led to the creation of the RCMP Security Service in the first place. As the 1920s gave way to the 30s and 40s, labor unions and strike activity were constant preoccupations of the security service. Although the service always insisted that trade union activity was legitimate, it also held fast to the belief that communist-inspired or communist-led labor unions was subversive and had to be stopped, or at least contained and quarantined. Even if suspected red leaders were democratically elected by the union rank and file, that didn't matter. In this new Cold War context, older distinctions between good unions, conservative, and bad unions, radical, which had dominated debates about labor relations for decades, hardened and sharpened, as the considerable resources of the security service were now put at the disposal of those who tangled with the bad unions, recalcitrant governments, hostile employers, and cold warriors within the labor movement itself. To be sure, the good unions were not always good in any sense other than their acceptable politics. The worst case was the American Seafarers International Union takeover in the late 1940s of the Canadian waterfront from the communist-led Canadian Seamen's Union. The SIU was under the leadership of the notorious labor racketeer and thug Hal Banks, but was fully supported by the Canadian government. But as the Mounties might say, in a war you take or make what allies you can. The demarcation between good and bad unions was paralleled by distinctions the political police had to draw between different varieties of left-wing political parties. There were early difficulties over socialist and social democratic parties, and after the founding of the CCF in 1932, they had to contend with a respectable social democratic party with representation in Parliament, and after 1944, of course, the government of Saskatchewan. A party, moreover, that was in direct competition with the communists for left-wing votes and for trade union support. Usually the Mounties were able to distinguish CCFers from Marxist communists. On the other hand, there was always a blurring of lines on the left wing of the CCF and its successor after 1961, the NDP, a gray area where the CCF-NDP could also be subjected to surveillance, and indeed a general watchful eye on the party and its leaders. Hence the targeting of the NDP in the 1970s, ostensibly on the pretext of targeting the left-wing waffle faction of the party. And in 2010, battle in the courts was waged to force disclosure of jealously guarded security service files on CCF leader Tommy Douglas, a man voted in a national poll the greatest Canadian, but clearly a suspect figure to a generation of security service watchers. I might add that the federal courts ordered the Library and Archives Canada, who hold the files, to release more of them. The current government said no, and it's going to appeal court next week, I think. There's thousands of pages, of which only about 400 severely censored pages have been released. There was a problem with the Mountie obsession with communist subversion, a very big problem. However much communists might be painted as foreign, alien, and un-Canadian, they were actually part of Canada as much as the Mounties were. And it was impossible to draw lines around the Reds as fit subjects for political policing while exempting all others. The very nature of subversion, to the extent that we can nail down any clear definition, is that it is directed at undermining from within the institutions and values of the society. To the Mounties, the communist problem was primarily one of subversive infiltration and penetration of the institutions of civil society. The Communist Party did view infiltration as a tactic, but the infiltrators were just as likely to see themselves as good trade unionists working for their members, as well as indirectly for the interests of the party, which would benefit from gains for the members. Yet seeing the infiltrators simply as subversive, the security service found it necessary to bring these infiltrated institutions under the same surveillance directed at the infiltrators. If the worry is communist infiltration of respectable trade unions, or citizen advocacy groups, or student councils, or peace groups, or any of the other myriad associations the communists might target, then the security service had to have sources of information on these groups, or to speak plainly, had to spy on them. Hence the network of informers, honeycombed in organizations across the country, reporting to the security service on the everyday activities of civil society. From the executive of the Canadian Labour Congress, to the Ladies Auxiliary Mine Mill and Smelter Workers Sudbury Local, to the various Voice of Women groups. Hence the public shock when the MacDonald Commission reported at the end of the 1970s that the RCMP Security Service held files on 800,000 individual Canadians and groups. Public distaste for this kind of infiltration of civil society began to rise in the 1960s and crested in the 1970s, when a number of developments came together. The Security Service, under cabinet direction, went to war against Quebec separatism and failed to make the necessary distinctions between threats to national security and threats to national unity. For the first time, political policing had become a seriously divisive factor in domestic politics. Intrusive surveillance of political life in English Canada also spilled into the media and into public consciousness at a time when concern for guarantees of individual rights was on the rise, culminating in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Distrust of the Cold War national security state had risen sharply in the United States as well as in Canada. The old Mountie war against subversion had to be cut back, qualified, and moderated in the face of these new realities. CSIS was created, with limits placed on its reach into Canadian society and mechanisms of accountability imposed upon it. The counter-subversion branch of CSIS was ordered closed, its files dispersed to the National Archives. And then at the end of the 1980s, the Soviet communist enemy collapsed and disappeared, and the Cold War came to an end. History, however, does not run in straight lines. While the developments of the 1970s and 80s pointed to an end to state surveillance of subversion and refocused on more politically neutral and less controversial targets, the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001 inaugurated a new era of a global war on terror under hegemonic American leadership that parallels in eerie ways the Cold War. Once again, emergency powers have been added to the state security arsenal, suspect communities constructed, and surveillance stepped up. Accountability mechanisms appropriate at the time of their inception now appear patchwork, threadbare, and outdated, and as I mentioned earlier, many of them are being eliminated. In some ways, the world of the 21st century would appear strange to the political police of the 20th. The specter of red revolution no longer haunts the world, and left-wing subversion has diminished to the vanishing point. Political policing has had to discard its old field manuals, but new ones are on the way. There is one thread that runs from the origins of political policing in the 19th century to the 21st century, a consistent source of both continuity and tension. State security intelligence is called into action by the perception of threats to national security and public safety. In a pluralist democratic society like Canada, political policing has never been acceptable on its own terms or as a good in itself, but rather as a kind of necessary evil required to protect liberal democracy from its enemies. The text of political policing, the defense of public safety, security, and the national interest, is widely proclaimed and widely applauded. The subtext, drawing boundaries that exclude some groups, whether ideological, ethnic, religious, or national, from full legitimacy as members of the Canadian community, is less often displayed publicly and is less widely approved. Those who criticize political policing often question the text as a way of drawing attention to the subtext. Official reports of threats to national security have been portrayed as greatly exaggerated, or deliberately concocted, or even imaginary. The imagery of witch hunts taken literally suggests either deliberate invention or social panic. However suspect the subtext, it would be a grave mistake to dismiss the text as deliberately duplicitous or merely misguided. In looking over the broad historical sweep in Canada, it is striking to us that the perceived threats to security that have triggered expanded political policing have at some level always had some substance. Violence was inherent to both the radical Irish and South Asian movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The violent political imagery of Fenian and South Asian militants, sometimes reflected in their actions, derived from an anti-imperialism that identified the Canadian state as an enemy and relied on force to achieve their goals. The specter of revolutionary unrest threatening the existing economic and political system was made real in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, with its apparent echoes in Canada with the Winnipeg General Strike and the formation of a Communist Party of Canada. Exaggerated as the Red Menace appears in retrospect, the Leninist model of the violent seizure of power by revolutionary militants was not one that could be easily tolerated by any liberal democracy. Given the faithful pro-Moscow line followed by the Canadian Communists from their inception, suspicions that the party harbored Bolshevik dreams of violent revolution had some plausibility, despite the actual absence of any revolutionary activities by communist militants over decades of activity. In the Cold War years, the threat of domestic revolution had vanished, but now Canadian communists were tied to the external threat of a hostile nuclear-armed superpower. When the idea of Quebec's sovereignty burst upon Canada in the 60s, it appeared in a dual guise, with one pursuing a lawful and legitimate route via the existing political process, and another that believed it could force independence through bombings and killing. The era of international terrorism, in which non-state actors attempt to advance political ideological agendas, exogenous and alien to Canada, through violence against civilians, was ushered in with the terrible Canadian toll of Air India, and continues in a post-9/11 world in which Canada and Canadians could well be targets. The text of security and public safety has a convincing solidity, an authenticity that has persuaded generations of Canadians readily and often unquestionably to accept the political policing of the borders of the public realm. This reality is ignored at critics' peril. Text is never, as some might have it, merely pretext, a cloak to cover the state's cynical manipulation of public anxieties, permitting the expansion of intrusive powers over civil society. Whatever the verdicts of revisionist history on the origins and causes of the Cold War, it is clear that if the Soviet threat had been entirely conjured up out of nothing, it could not have maintained its hold on the public for so many decades. Similarly, 9/11 conspiracy theorists who downplay or even deny the reality of al-Qaeda-type threats failed to appreciate the entirely understandable anxiety of ordinary people in the face of violence directed at them that appears inexplicably irrational. Whatever grievances of the Muslim world against the West are cited in the apocalyptic rhetoric of the Islamist extremists against the infidels. Matters, however, cannot be left there. Text has indeed been transformed into pretext again and again. Precisely when the text is authentic and thus convincing, the danger of its abuse is greatest. A common pattern throughout Canadian history is the appearance of a real threat to security and public safety, followed by a state response that identifies and isolates the source of the threat, security intelligence, acts to eliminate or contain the threat, security law enforcement, and and then goes on to construct suspect communities, ideological, ethnic, religious, from which threats are said to emanate, and to marginalize, stigmatize, exclude, and delegitimize these communities. And that's political policing. There seems to be a peculiar alchemy whereby terrorism, espionage, and covert foreign interference, legitimate threat categories, are too often transmuted by political policing into the dubious, ill-defined, and thus remarkably elastic category of subversion. Combating the former threats should be an activity that commands a broad consensus. Combating subversion is always an invidious political intervention in civil society. The search for Soviet spies during the Cold War was unexceptional. When the search turned to agents of influence, the stakes grew more ideological. As the security service began spying on communist, leftist, and even sexual subversives, the search became a witch hunt. Even with the closure of the counter-subversion branch of CSIS in the 1980s, the alchemical process continues in the post-9/11 world. The question of subversion points to another contested dimension of political policing: the closure of public debate over legitimate grievances and concerns that may have helped spark the kind of violent protests that lead to the targeting of suspect communities. When Irish Republicans and South Asian radicals entered into violent or potentially violent confrontations with the Canadian state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the extremism of their actions grew out of legitimate grievances against racist oppression by British imperialism of Irish Catholics and colonized Indians. Yet the effect of the political policing of their violent tactics was to strengthen the oppression and deepen further the very sense of injustice that had caused them to turn to violence. The Irish Protestant opponents of republicanism, represented in the aggressive Orange Order, were legitimized by linkage to British imperial hegemony, even as the Irish Catholic community was being defined as suspect and disloyal on the basis of the actions of the Fenians. British rule in India was reaffirmed along with the racial exclusion of Asians from equality in Canada as the state acted to counter the Asian radicals. When the RCMP targeted communists and trade unions, they also targeted legitimate working class demands for better wages and working conditions, while at the same time intervening, in effect, on behalf of business. However obfuscated in official rhetoric, the bias in favor of capital over labor was unmistakable. The inability to distinguish reliably between legitimate Quebec sovereigntists threatening national unity and violent separatists threatening national security bedeviled Canadian federalism from the 1960s to the 1980s, and perhaps will again. The existence of legitimate aspirations and justifiable grievances on the part of communities from which violent movements emerge does not, of course, excuse violence or offer exemption from the laws of the land. Pointing out that political violence may result from oppression and injustice is rational social science, not a philosophical justification for violence. Nor do all violent movements arise from legitimate causes. But where it does exist, the link between violence and injustice should not be missed because of the light it casts on the bias of political policing. CSIS in the 21st century, operating on a statutory mandate with imposed restraints on its reach and methods, and with layers of accountability surrounding its operations, has shed some, although not all, of the ideological baggage of the old RCMP security service. But there may be inherent limitations on how far this liberalization can proceed in practice, and I think recent events are suggesting that. When CSIS and the RCMP are called upon to intervene in the political life of the society, and especially when their intervention extends beyond genuine threats to security to encompass the alleged subversion of the established order, they appear all too frequently as agents of political repression, defenders of wealth and power against dissent and resistance. In short, they appear as the Praetorian Guard of conservatism. Moreover, they are guards with access to extraordinary powers who operate in privileged secrecy. Political policing in a liberal democracy is inherently controversial. Separating the uncontroversial elements of the protection of national security and public safety from the contentious elements of political policing is as complex as finding the famous delicate balance between freedom and security that successive Canadian governments have striven to achieve. Perhaps the most optimistic observation we can make in the early 21st century is that the process is now, or at least it was, more in the open than it ever has been in the past. Thank you.
Well, before I open the floor to questions, Greg, you didn't say much about oversight or spying on intellectuals at Canadian universities. I assume it has happened.
Has happened is happening. It's a big book, as Eddie already suggested, and there is a fair amount of discussion about that. In the early 1960s, the very young CAUT thought that it had struck a deal with the RCMP security service that would keep it off of campuses. The deal was, on the Mounties' part, a kind of Jesuitical one, where what it said implied that they weren't going to, but in effect they had been and continued to do so. With the rise of the New Left and the student movement of the late 1960s and the anti-war movement, it intensified. And there's a very good book, but one of the reasons why we don't spend more time on this is there is actually a very good book called Spying 101 by a colleague named Steve Hewitt, who teaches in England, but is a Canadian historian, which studies exactly that. But as you can well imagine, if you think, I mean, quite aside from their interest in communist professors or Marxist professors or anybody who was dissident, and similarly students, in addition, of course, universities are a crossroad of the world for the kind of ethnic groups that I was describing. Professors from countries that are, for whatever reason, being marginalized, of course, are likely to be targets as well.
So the floor is open for questions for Greg. So we have mics, which we would like, and I would ask folks asking their questions to say their name and just identify themselves. For,
Yeah, for the record.
Mr. X?
It's actually Bill Parenteau from the History Department,
for those who are keeping notes.
but I don't name names.
I was just a curiosity-based question, Greg. I'm just wondering how, in terms of the book, what the sort of scope and the dynamics of surveillance and the environmental movement is in society.
The current government has made it very clear that environmental groups are high on their list. One assumes that the Canadian Security Intelligence Service does listen to the government that it's supposed to serve, and I would assume, I don't have any documentary evidence, that that puts environmental groups high on their list now. You'll also recall that in thinking about the way that we pose the argument, that one of the things you want to demonstrate if you're going to target them and avoid the fact you're not supposed to be doing counter-subversion is, of course, to identify them with foreign interests. And I think it's not accidental that much of the rhetoric of the Harper government with regard to environmentalist movements has been lately to identify them with American or other foreign groups, which somehow then start to bring them in under a whole other rhetorical, or not rhetorical, but a whole other legal basis on which their interest would be legitimated. So I actually wrote environmentalists into that list because it's relatively recent that that's come to the fore. Well, I think environmentalists need to give people of Islamic and origins probably pride of place at the moment in terms of interest. But it is certainly something that they're interested in because of their interest in resource development. The resource development question, of course, becomes really interesting when you've got CSIS out of saying one thing and the government seemingly wanting to do another about oil development in the tar sands too.
Lyle Skinner, student faculty of law. Could you just comment on how the charter has changed the surveillance of Canadians? I'm assuming that it's still going on, and is there of course it's still going on, but is there less of a frequency of official documentation, or is it to have things officially on record, or are you just talking about how the charter constrains or alters the I guess the more freewheeling and intelligence gathering as you alluded to in the 1920s?
Well, I think the major way the charter has had an impact has been the role that the charter has played in providing Canadian judges with arguments to oppose security certificates. Security certificates being the legal apparatus by which the security service is able to identify somebody as a threat and then basically lock them away for, in their mind, as long as they want to. And many Arabs and some Africans of Islamic descent have had this happen to them. When their lawyers have been able to get this is done in a kind of star chamber kind of way as well. When their lawyers are able to get these cases before the federal courts, there have been a series of rulings that have been very damaging to CSIS. And they're based on charter rights. So I think that's been the limitation. The other major legal change that we didn't talk about, but this book could not have been written without, was, of course, access to information legislation. I actually got into this as a labor historian because of my interest in 1919 and the labor revolt and when the RCMP first started on all this. The access to information legislation meant that they actually had to start to cough material up, but of course they have an elaborate array of exemptions to do with national security that they make use of. So I, under a different regime in the Access Office, and this tells you how long it took to write this book, this goes back to the late 1980s, there was actually a case that was going to bear my name which was trying to argue that, you know, that exempting 1919 documents in 1989 was just not justifiable. The Information Commissioner changed, and the new one didn't want to take the case to court for fear of losing, which is always, as you well know, being a law student, always a major concern, because you lose important precedents, you're further behind than where you were. So it didn't get taken. But the arguments that we made about the Tommy Douglas papers are similar arguments. I just actually reviewed the arguments in that case. And in my case, they were arguing that these documents should remain in perpetuity secret, because it would be a threat to their current source program. They're now arguing for something equivalent of a 100-year rule, which means that pretty soon I'll be able to get the Winnipeg document. However, if you go on the CSIS website, and in the current annual report, there's a strong statement about how they're really interested in revealing all their history. So maybe there's hope.
Do we have other questions?
Jane Fritz?
She is.
Greg, at one point you said that the CSIS had to be nudged by senior bureaucrats. And in one of your answers just now, you said you assume that they listen to their political leaders. So before you even started speaking, what I was interested in was whether there is a change in approach, forced or otherwise, from government ideology to government, whether are fights about this, whether they try to be their own masters and try to ignore their political masters as much as possible. What can you tell us about that?
Some of this is the hardest to get at because they especially apply exemptions to communications within government between them and their minister and stuff. I don't think very much changed, be it liberal or conservative governments, basically for most of the 20th century. I think the current government, which is ideologically, I think, significantly more different than what we've seen in previous governmental changes, might make a difference, and certainly the question that Bill posed is one of the ways I would see that. By and large, governments have had and I don't think it's just true of Canada, they have a very funny relationship with their security services because they're really caught up with deniability. So there's some things they just don't want to know. And, you know, and sometimes the political police become, in effect, the whipping boy for things that probably they were charged with doing. Certainly the excesses in Quebec in the 1970s were basically because Trudeau was so, whatever the appropriate verb is, about 1970, that they were unleashed. And they really, you know, I think that the guys that did all the really bad things that the Keb Commission and the McDonald Commission discovered, thought they were mandated to do that. So, you know, whoever had the brilliant idea of stealing the membership lists of the Parti Québécois undoubtedly thought they were doing what the government wanted. But when you get a minister that actually tries to do something, and the best example of this was Warren Almond, a Trudeau cabinet minister, who I think was Solicitor General in the late 70s, they get turned on. He was kind of a left liberal, and left liberals are, at the end of the day, especially if they're trying to do something in this domain, pretty suspect characters. So they spied on him.
So as an NDP, we're actually to form a government in some kind of an interesting relationship.
It would be fraught. And for those of you who read spy fiction or are familiar with MI5 and MI6 kind of issues, I mean, the Labour government was always suspicious. I mean, there are elements of MI5 that still think Harold Wilson was a Soviet spy. The FBI thought that Mike Pearson was a Soviet agent. That's why he was protecting Herbert Norman. so there's, and I mean, at the height, I think there was a quick allusion to the war against moles, that just totally almost destroyed Western intelligence agencies, so that they were so convinced that they had been even more fully penetrated than the British one had already discovered to have been. And the Americans tore themselves apart. A guy named Angleton at the CIA just tore the agency apart seeking moles. And the Canadian thing, I mean, it was the guy that got victimized in Canada was this guy Jim Bennett, who ended up retired off in Australia because they didn't trust him, but they couldn't prove anything. And it turned out he was totally innocent, and the real guy was the guy that I mentioned, this guy Brunet, who was, because he was a real Mountie as opposed to a civilian, at a Cape with a RCMP pedigree, whereas Bennett was a Labour Party supporter Brit who had emigrated to Canada. He was done.
I think we have time for one further question. Alice, I saw your hand up.
Special agent White Ball.
In disguise for the evening.
I would,
You grew a little, Dwight.
with your vast experience in this area,
Here comes the mayor.
as you well know, we do have a file on you. I'm just curious.
We
whether-
do.
Whether you've been able to access that under the right to information, and did you find it interesting? And just one related question, as you look around this gathering, with your vast experience, would you venture a guess as to how many of us are here watching you?
We'll do them in the order you asked. Yes, I did have a security service, or an RCMP security service file, which I was able to access under the privacy legislation because it's my file. It was interesting because they had me at places that I have no memory of having been at. Which, given that it was the late 60s, doesn't mean that I was necessarily not there. But I'm pretty sure I wasn't. And it was,
Plausible deniability.
absolutely. Yeah, actually, that's their favorite answer is maybe we do and maybe we don't, but we don't have to tell. Anyway, so there was a file, and no, it wasn't of all that much interest. Although one of the best parts of it, which I published in an article, I don't think it made it into the book, was that there's this great piece on the 1977, what were then called the Meetings of the Learned Societies, which were the last time it was held in Fredericton until 2011, at which there was a lengthy report from a historian, of course unidentified, about the activities of the Canadian Committee on Labor History, which was I was actively involved in, and actually they had taken out a couple of names, and I knew from the context that one of the names was my own, so of course I appealed to the commissioner and said, how can they take out my own name? It's my file. Anyway, they then released that the other name was Leo Panich, who's a political scientist, a friend of Reg's. But it was really interesting because it was this elaborate thing about how we were plotting to write, I mean, in effect, to write this history, and how we were going to, embarrass them greatly by exposing all of this stuff. And, I mean, it was well beyond what I was thinking of, but I thought, not a bad idea. So we did. I don't know if there's actually, given contemporary CSIS kind of things, if there's somebody here from CSIS, they might want to actually say hello, or on the other hand, that'd just be embarrassing. But sure, I would. God, I would hope there's somebody here. That's what they're supposed to do, and they should be interested in their own history above all. I don't know if they're buying a lot of the book or not.
All right, well, I think I'll draw this part of the evening to a close. Let us sincerely thank our speaker for an entertaining and thoughtful evening. I'm sure if folks do have further questions, Greg will be more than willing to answer them in the lobby afterwards, or maybe in some closet. This book, I believe there's a book launch. The date is October 23. Is that correct?
That's
Where will
right.
that be?
Tilly
Gary?
Probably Tilly 28 unless we think there'll be a larger crowd.
Tilly Hall.
There'll be lots of announcements.
Stay tuned. We may have even the author there to sign it in blood. Something.
I hope not.
All right, thank you all very much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed the evening. That helps. Yeah, there is something to that.